So we've finally gotten some additional information on the two Vault Hunters we really don't know much about, which are Amon and Harlowe, because Game Informer recently released an article that goes a bit more into some of the specifics of how these characters are going to work and what their specials are. More specifically, what their traits are, because I think the traits for most of the Vault Hunters are going to play a pretty important role in how they work and how they're going to play. So we're going to go over the information that we got from this article on both of those. Then we'll also go over the information they give on both Rafa and Vex, even though we know a lot about those two characters already because we've seen the entirety of their skill trees. So first up, we have Amon. Amon is the hulking brute of the Borderlands 4 Vault Hunter roster, standing at over 7 feet, which the developers did also say is the tallest Vault Hunter they've ever made. I think the biggest as well. His movement is noticeably more tank-like than the other playable characters, but he can still run, jump, and traverse the world as well as the rest of the Vault Hunters. But where he gets really interesting is how unique his action skills are actually going to play. So Amon's action skills lean heavier into melee and projectile gameplay, and his trait allows him to have a second action skill associated with each primary one. So just to compare that to Vex, which we've known her trait for a long time, Vex's trait is that whatever weapon she has in her hand, if it's elemental, is what elemental damage she'll be dealing from her action skills. So if she has a corrosive weapon in her hand, that's the damage her action skills will be dealing. But for Amon, he gets to basically have two action skills. Now, this isn't two of his actual action skill choices. This is just that he gets a secondary action skill that is specifically tied to the first one. Then they go on to give some examples. So Crucible allows him to throw elemental axes at his enemy, which is what we've seen. He spawns like the fire and ice axes and throws them. That's pretty much the first thing we ever got to see him do. But its secondary action skill gives him a multi-elemental throw. So I'm not sure what this is meaning, if it's like an axe that has multiple elements tied into it at once, or maybe he gets to throw both of his axes, or maybe he can change their elements, but that's his secondary action skill tied to the primary. Then he has his onslaught action skill, which gives him a powerful flaming punch, with a secondary action skill seeing him slam a hammer into the ground to deal fiery AoE damage. We've seen both of these. In fact, one of the first trailers we got to see gameplay of, we actually got to see Amon do that big frontal punch that made this big cone of fire behind him. We also did get to see the secondary of this, which he slams on this massive fire hammer. So the primary is that punch, but the secondary is a big fiery hammer. And I think the connecting thing there is just doing a lot of fiery damage. His most unique action skill could very well be Scourge, where he summons a shield that can absorb damage, then pay it back to enemies with a projectile whip. So we've gotten to see both of these. He spawns in that big shield that was also in one of the CGI trailers. We also get to see him using his whip. Presumably this is the kind of cryo whip where he could shoot out projectiles from it. It's sounding like here that you get the shield and the whip at the same time, so you can block and then also use the whip, which is pretty cool. But then in Scourge, he can also spawn a wall of fire that blocks incoming enemy fire and provides cover for you and your team. So it seems the primary is a shield and the whip. The secondary is this firewall to block all projectiles, which is also incredibly strong. If this works against certain things, this could be absolutely ridiculous against bosses, especially any bosses that have projectiles, especially with bosses seeming much more involved. This could be something that's incredibly strong, even though this action skill seems to be almost fully defensive based. And they also say that what's interesting about Amon is he's probably our most elemental based character, which kind of seems to be the case. I know they've been saying that Vex isn't really elemental based because her action skills don't have an element baseline, but you can also just use an elemental weapon and make everything she can use be elemental. But pretty much everything Amon is using does also seem to be one of the elements, and I'm very curious to see how much of elemental changing he's going to be able to do with his different action skills. And next up, we have Harlo, and Harlo's abilities center around a mechanic called entanglement. When enemies are afflicted with this rainbow glowing ailment, damage dealt to 1 spreads to impact all enemies currently entangled. So this is already massive, and we finally get to learn what this rainbow effect on enemies is. One of the first gameplay trailers, we got to see Harlo spawn this massive ball that went through an enemy and put this rainbow elemental effect on them, and we didn't actually know what that was, but that is now entanglement, which is going to be crazy. But it's basically just any enemy with entanglement on them, which is the rainbow effect, will get the damage that you're dealing to any of the other ones. That also just means that AoE damage is going to be absolutely ridiculous, and this is something kind of similar to what Amara had in Borderlands 3, where you'd basically connect all of the enemies, so when you're dealing damage to one, it's dealing damage to all of them. This one just seems it's going to have a bit bit of a different mechanic because it seems to be anything from your action skills, so you could actually use it more effectively. And her action skills apply it in various ways. With 0 points, Harlo can use telekinesis style powers to lift an enemy off its feet and suspend it in mid-air. It seems this is a thing we've seen multiple times where she puts them up in a bubble. Harlo can slam the affected enemy into objects, the ground, and even other enemies, with any enemy hit by the floater also impacted by entanglement. Her Chroma Accelerator action skill lets her charge up an explosive, unstoppable energy pocket that blasts forward, entangling enemies caught in line of fire of its enormous radius. Finally, Flux Generator sees Harlo drop a pulse mine that entangles any creatures caught in the wide radius. So those seem to be your 3 action skills. She could put people in the bubbles and throw them around or just keep them CC'd up there. She has the big orb of elemental blast that we got to see in one of the first trailers where she shoots forward this big blast. Any enemies hit are entangled and seem to take damage. In that gameplay trailer when she used it, we also get to see it explode into a nuke. Presumably that may be an augment for it. And then the final one being this Flux Generator where she drops these pulse mines around with a pretty big radius. Then they go on to say she's a crowd control, and there's a lot of different augments and abilities that will help when you have co-op partners with entanglement. And they say, if I entangle enemies, that's a signal to my co-op buddies, hey, look over here, there's somebody who's susceptible. But you can take it and slam it on each of the individual people, and now while everybody else is shooting at them, everybody's sharing the damage and they're all going to die. So something that's really interesting here, everybody in your party, if you're playing with other players, will also be spreading that damage with entanglement, which just makes it kind of ridiculous for groups. If you're planning on playing with a group, definitely make sure you have someone with Harlo, because you can just hit everybody with entanglement and all of your group shooting them will be spreading that damage. And I do think Harlo is going to have some absolutely ridiculous combinations. If you can get certain weapon rolls that have, say, bouncing projectiles, maybe even something like a Jacobs build where you get all the different Jacobs elements to where it'll ricochet on crits, to where it could ricochet on non-crits, all that type of stuff, and then you just entangle all enemies and then you're ricocheting bullets everywhere. That could be pretty good. Or weapons that maybe have like bouncing discs or something like that. Any type of cleave or AoE damage with entanglement is going to be ridiculous. And then we have Rafa. Rafa is built to be the more of the run and gun character. The Exosoldier makes heavy use of his Digistruct abilities, which allow him to store a virtual blueprint and create new weaponry on demand. Using this, he fills out his action skills with auto-aiming turrets, a Samus from Metroid-style arm cannon, and even dual-arm blades. This allows him to be among the most versatile and approachable Vault Hunters in Borderlands 4. And then they go on to say Rafa has all of the Digistruct abilities, so he can do big damage on a couple of things, but he can also get really close in with his blades. One of the things that he is really good with is his elements, his corrosive. You can really spec into that and destroy your enemies with corrosive, or switch that up and hit with some other hack and slash style things. And Rafa is pretty interesting because it seems his trait is not actually super integral to how he plays. It's pretty good. It's called Overdrive. When you use an action skill, it gives you this overdrive buff that lasts for 12 seconds when the action skill ends, but when your action skill is active, it's always active, and it gives you a pretty big movement speed boost and then also just an overall damage boost. So he seems to be the character that wants to always be in an action skill or have one up every 12 seconds so you can keep that boost active all the time, but that's not like super integral to how his character would actually work, which definitely makes him a bit interesting. But he also has one of the most interesting skills in the game as well. His dual-sided blades puts you in third person, and it seems like they last a long time at a baseline. And then next up, we have Vex, the character I think I'm going to be playing and the character we've been able to see the earliest out of all of the others. Vex is the Dark Siren of Borderlands 4. Rather than being highly focused on elemental damage like more traditional Sirens, Vex's kit is more geared towards summoning. But the elemental side isn't completely phased out, as her summon entities take on the elemental affinity of whatever gun she equips, which is what we went over. But what's super interesting is how you can use this sometimes. One of her action skills is you get to summon these 3 different summons that can either be these more range versions that shoot at enemies and deal more damage, or these scythe wielding enemies that I think have a taunt, and you can summon 3 of them with any variation of the summons you have for those 3. But you could also make those 3 summons completely different elements. You could have a corrosive weapon out, summon 1, have it be corrosive, switch to a different weapon, have it be cryo, summon a cryo, and then say use a melee one, switch to like radiation and have the third be radiation. So even though at a baseline Vex isn't elemental damage, I think she still has the biggest mastery over the elements, especially if you're using those elemental weapons. Then they go on to say Vex is able to change the elements, and she's who I have mained a lot. The ability to add a siren whose trait or affinity is elemental has been really cool to see, because you can put out those specters and reapers, but if you're fighting two different enemy types, you could change the element if you have an element on your gun. And then her action skills, in Dead Ringer, she can either summon up to 3 melee focus reapers or turret style specters. Again, you can do any mix of those you want. While Phase Familiar lets her call her beastly minion called Trouble that can teleport and deal AoE damage at command. She also has the Incarnate action skill to choose from, which she then creates explosions that damage enemies and buff Vex. And again, through all of her action skills, her trait allows her to change the element. And also, Incarnate looks the coolest. That's the one where she pops out her big wings, and then she constantly shoots out these different projectiles. Again, you can change those elements, but I'm not actually sure if that changes her wing color. That would be really cool if you change elements and her wings change that color, but she's primarily focused on summons, with her Incarnate being more of the spellcaster side. But that's pretty much all the information we now have on Harlo, on Aean, and we pretty much know everything about Rafa and Vex already. I will be going over their skill trees sometime in the future, and also make sure to subscribe, because at some point I will also be doing a ton of theory crafting builds, probably as we get closer to launch. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.